Welcome back to the channel of Truth, Trust, and Transparency. This particular video is dedicated to our YouTube community. I had a question in the comments yesterday, maybe the day before, asking Dave, would you consider, or when would you consider, when does a granny flat work? Obviously, this is opinion. This is not financial advice. Everyone's got opinions. The numbers don't lie. Let's break down where I see it used, maybe incorrectly, and then where I see it as a valuable tool. For me personally, the narrative with a lot of people, buyers, agents, all those sorts of things, is to buy the house, grow in, let it grow in equity, get the equity out, use that to buy a granny flat, and then you've got a really cool house that's yielding 6% or anything or something like that. I think in the early stages, in the accumulation stages, this is actually holding your portfolio back. So if you're in that, first and foremost, what I'd say about this is you need to come up with a bulletproof plan. We use game plans with our members. We map that out. Where do you want to go to? How long of the time frame do we need? How much passive income? All those kinds of things. You need to map it out. And then from there, we're going to know how many properties that you need. If you don't have that and you just have that buyer's agent that goes, oh yeah, we'll buy your property, yeah, we'll buy your property, then we'll put a granny flat on it, blah, blah, blah. You don't really have the plan. And I think if you do that in the accumulation phase, i.e. buying the amount of properties that you need to get to that end goal, there might be a few sell downs or anything like that. That's why you need the plan. But if you're just willy-nilly buying it and putting the granny flat on and you don't have the plan, you don't know how many properties you need, I think it's going to stunt your portfolio growth. And I'll show you how. So let's say you buy one $750,000 property. Here's my costs to purchase. I spent $134,000. Now, obviously, I've spent all my money. I'm just waiting on that property to increase in price enough for me to withdraw the equity and then make another purchase. I have to wait until I have $220,000 to withdraw that equity for a granny flat. So let's say the value goes up to 1.1. It means I still have my original loan of $660,000, which is $750 minus the deposit. I then will take out the $220,000. And you have two options here. You can buy more property or you can buy the granny flat. Let's look at the granny flat play. A $660,000 loan against the house. You now have 100% loan against the granny flat. That $220,000 is a loan. You've used that to build and construct the granny flat, meaning you have total debt of $880,000. Now, let's talk about what that's going to cost you. $880,000 at a 6% rent currently is going to cost you $52,800. We also know there's going to be about $10,000 worth of maintenance costs, upkeep, insurance, those kinds of things. Maybe it's even a little bit higher. But I'm going to say my costs are around $62,000 for this exercise. When we look at what the rent is going to return, I'm going to say conservatively the house is going to rent at 5%, and I'm also going to get $500 a week, which for me would be a nice investment. We know that then those two added together would bring in $63,500 in rent. Now there might be a little bit of depreciation in there. I can hear it's only going to be a few $1,000s in this case, as you'll see. Once we take away the expense, once we take away the cost of the money, meaning the loan on the house and the loan to build the granny flat, and then we look at the rent, $63,000, we're only $700 up in terms of positive. So it's almost a neutrally geared property. And we're going to say that the 1.1, all the bank did was add the value of the granny flat, which is $220 on top of that, and it gives us a $1.32 million one property worth that much money. Now, if we follow this through a conservative 6% growth rate, because remember, we've had the really good run that we've had up here. We just run it through a conservative 6% growth rate. In the first year, 1.32 becomes 1.399, becomes 1.482, becomes 1.570, becomes 1.664. So at the end of 4 years, I have a property worth $1.664 million. I have debt on it of $880,000, which means I have usable equity of $551,000. Now, if you look at that, you go, look, Dave, it's covered my expenses. It's not a bad option. If you're in the accumulation phase though, remember the accumulation phase is when we're starting out, we need to buy as many properties as possible to hit our game plan in the most compressed time frame. Why the most compressed time frame? Because we want to start that compound clock. If you buy a property every 6 years, it's going to take you forever. And if you always keep buying, those properties that you keep buying, they need to go through those growth rate cycles. You need to hold them for those 10 to 20 years. So in this case, it doesn't look too bad. 450 grand of usable equity, $1.6 million property. However, let's look at what else we could do with that sort of money. Now, we know from my previous videos that we can buy another property with 220 grand of equity. We can actually buy another two. We can buy another two $550,000 houses. We're going to put 75 grand deposit, 22 stamps, 5 grand LMI, legals, BP, that and that. They're going to cost about 107 grand each. We're going to do two of them. Now, we've taken this out. This is an equity loan against my original 660. So I have 880 loan. So that's covered the price of the next two properties. Yeah? That's here. $1.1 million house. This is the original house. And now my debt is a little bit more. My debt is the same. However, the value is less because I haven't added on the value of the granny flat. Now, with just that property, we see that go to 1.166, 1.235, 1.309. It grows to 1.38 million with $229,000 of usable equity. But what we can also do with these two purchases is we can get into a more warm spot market. We can look for growth areas that do 6% in the first year, 10% in the second year, 15, and then back down to 10, and then that would be 6 after that. So what does that mean? Well, we've got $950,000 on debt on this side of the portfolio. Why? 550 minus that deposit that we took down. Remember, that's all equity. We've used it here. We've got it in there. That's all the equity captured. And then the loan for the actual rest of the properties is 475 times it by 2, 950 a debt. Now, in the first year, we don't have usable equity because we're highly leveraged. Year 2, 75 because they're both the two $550,000 properties. They've done 6%, then they've done 10%. We get a bit of equity. Now look to year 3, we're up to 1.474 million. We have $229,000 of usable equity. And then in year 4, again, we go up to 1.62 million with $340,000 in usable equity. Now, if we look at this, we're almost at the same value without the additional dwelling. So in this side of the portfolio, if you use that 220,000 to grow your portfolio, you'd have 3 properties worth $3 million, which is that price there plus that price there. You'd have $1.8 million worth of debt, which is obviously 950 plus 880, meaning you're sitting at a 60% LVR, and you'd have $500,000 worth of usable equity, which is more than enough, which is more than as well if you were just leaving it under the one granny flat plan. Now, obviously I haven't factored in depreciation, I haven't factored in the cash flow, and I haven't factored in the serviceability because I don't know if you're able to service these 3 purchases. $1.8 million worth of debt. You do have some rent there to offset that, but obviously you're going to need to be able to service it. In my opinion, the granny flat play is, if I'm in the accumulation phase, I'm going to be focused on building out. So I've got 2 properties at 800 now and one at 1.3. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 1.3 with 880 of debt. And then I've got 2 at 800, call it 800, with 475 each of debt. Now, the most powerful about this, because I've got 3 properties now instead of just the one, I've got a really interesting portfolio where I can choose to do a couple of things. Now, I could hold one of these through the next 3-4 years, and then I could sell it off when it hits $1 million. Hits $1 million, I'm in at 475, I've got some other costs, maybe you come out of that clean 500 grand. Well, then with 500 grand, I could put on a granny flat on each of those in cash. That way, I can come back and say, well, this property now is passive income, 25 grand a year. Let's use 500 bucks a week, 25 grand a year in cash. That's where I think granny flats come in later on compared to in this particular situation, because all I need to do, all I could even do is use the 50K in rent, and maybe I just pay down this debt here. I pay down that debt. That would be, let's do a quick calculation. 50 grand, there's 475 grand in debt. Let's just say 10 years. 10 years. Let's just say 10 years. And you know what? Because you've got the rent coming in, it's probably something more like 7 years. So if you don't need the money and you'll keep working, then then look at the portfolio. After you pay that off, you'd have 50 grand coming in from the granny flats, and then 800K. Now, obviously it's not a 5% yield because we've bought it at we probably bought it at a 5% yield. So even at a 7% rent, 7% rental yield, that's probably 50K as well. So I've got 100K of passive income of those assets, and then I've just got to worry about that debt now. Or maybe you can sell off. Up to you. However, that's where I see granny flats come into play. Now, let me evolve this in a little bit more context for part 2 of this video. So to elaborate a little bit further, if the granny flats aren't going to be used at the front half, because we have seen it since the growth, when do they come in? This is where planning needs to come into play, and it's going to depend a little bit around how much money you can save, how much money you can bring in from, say, your business, company, all that kind of stuff. But I really like granny flats coming into play when you can put down a big deposit on them and they can start to churn through and either pay off debt or be vehicles for cash flow to pay down those properties. So, you could get to 1, 2, 3, you could get to 4 properties, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 properties. Now, the granny flats, in my opinion, are that cash flow play. So you might get to here and then you might run out of servicing. If you've leveraged into each of these, into the next, into the next, into the next, there is a good play. You're going to be high on your LVR and you're going to be bleeding a bit of cash, especially if it's 6% interest rate. So the granny flats can come in to ease a bit of that cash flow. So you might attach off one, boom, granny, or boom, granny. And then we use it as an advanced method to pay down and attack the debt on potentially 1 or on potentially 2, pay that debt off, or we can even, as I said before, wait for that property that's 400. Maybe it's done really well. It's not now at 900 grand. We need to run the numbers and we need to make sure, as I say in my previous videos, we hold that property for long enough. But you might come out and say, okay, I want to get to 75 grand of passive income. So this might be your property. This is where you can use granny flats to your power. So I think it's in back end, it's in consolidation mode, it's in cash flow mode, it's in all those areas. I don't think it belongs personally in the front end of your portfolio, because we can use that money to get into more assets that are going to compound in growth quicker than it will a granny flat. So you might accumulate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties. 1, 2, 3. You might accumulate 5 properties. You bought them for 300. You've bought them for 300, 5 properties. Now, in 10 years' time, I don't know what the timeline is your portfolio, but let's run it. In 10 years' time, these 2 are going to be worth 700, which I think is quite conservative. When you look at the Perths, when you look at the Melbournes, and you look at the Brisbanes, 300 to 700K over 10 years, I think is conservative. It can definitely happen. We saw properties do 40, 50, 60, 80% over a very short window. And these properties, you might have sold them at 800K, sold, 800K, sold. Now, I'm obviously going to profit maybe 450 a piece. 450 a piece. Okay. Here's where it comes into play. I've got 900 grand. Now, I could do one or two things. I could pay down the debt on all of those. So with that 900K, I've still got $900,000 of debt on these properties, all worth 700. I've sold those two off. I've paid a little bit of tax. Let's just say round ballpark figures. So what you could do is you could pay off the debt on all three of those. Now, if they're yielding, say, 4%, they're going to bring in 28K each. Times that by 3 equals passive. So they might bring in $84,000. There you go. 3 properties, 84K. Or what we could do instead is we could put granny flat, granny flat, granny flat to pay down the debt even quicker. Remember, the granny flats are bringing in 25K a year, 25K a year. And then I could use the 450 to pay off one fully and then pay off a bit of the debt on both of those. 450. I'm bringing in 50 grand on that, 50K on that. I'm bringing in 28K on that, $28,000 on that, which you're looking at me and saying, Dave, 78K, it's less. However, once I pay these two off, I'd add another 40K to them, $126,000. So now it might take you a little bit longer to pay down the debt on over those, but as you can see, that's what I do. That's how I would use potentially 50 grand per year in rent to be paying down each of those, because 6 years from the granny flat rent alone can pay off one of these. Now, if you add on the rent that you're getting, that yield, which is 28K, 28K, so hang on, 28K, that's 4% on the 700K, plus 50, $78,000. In almost 4 years, you'll pay that. In almost 4 years, you pay off the second one. In 4 years, you'll pay off the second one. And that's actually not including the rent from the first one. You know, so it's almost as if you can do a little bit of a waterfall here. And then on the third one, you have the 28K from the first one. You have the 28K from the second property. You have the first granny flat at 25K. And then you have the rent on this property too, 28. And then you've got the granny flat too. You pay that property off in 2 years. So that's how you quickly consolidate, and that's where I see granny flats working, in my opinion. You've got to be careful if you have your buyer's agents and those type of people telling you to buy granny flats. If they are controlling the building company, then expect the granny flat to be inflated. The price of that granny flat to be inflated 60, 80, 100 grand, because they're going to make they're going to make a clip on that as well, just so you guys know. But that's how I'd use it. I'd use it in the back end of my portfolio if I need to add in cash flow. If I need to add in and increase my cash flow, but I don't have it, maybe I've got some money saved, or if I can sell down an asset, redeploy it across a couple to pay down those assets a lot quicker, to get me to that retirement age. Or if you are in sort of business, if you're in business, developer like me, I'll come and put the granny flat in cash, provided I've built out the portfolio, and that will pay me that $25,000 a year in passive income. And you only need 4 of those granny flats paid in cash to hit your 100 grand. But that's sort of how I do it. As always, thoughts, questions, emotions, let me know in the comments. If not, I'll see you tomorrow.